Asedio ruso a Huliaipole.
Russian siege of Huliaipole. While all eyes were on the Russian advances in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, suddenly the Russian armed forces began making huge gains in the Zaporizhzhia region. The situation looks tragically grim for Ukraine. The Ukrainian government has already ordered the evacuation of all towns up to the capital city of Zaporizhzhia. A desperate situation for Ukraine. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin broadcast number 289 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Joining us from Madrid, Spain, is Mr. Fernando Moragón. Fernando, how are things over there?
Señor Fernando Moragón. Fernando, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Bien, bien. A ver, no te lo vas a creer, pero yo vamos, después mirar.
All right. Look, you're not going to believe it, but I mean, you can check, you can verify. It's November 12th, right? Mid-autumn. You'd expect the temperature to be not cold, but around 59, 60, 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Today, I emphasize November 12th, it's 73 degrees. Or it was 73 degrees. It's crazy. I mean, I don't remember that in mid-November you could practically sit outside on a terrace in just a shirt to have a drink. This isn't normal. Look, I understand this brings a lot of things, a lot of problems. But from a selfish point of view, this climate change thing is working out great for me. Having these temperatures in November, well, sure, later Spain will turn into a desert, but I'll already be dead. What do I care? From a selfish point of view, just to be clear. Well, just enjoying myself. You know how it goes. Since I had some errands to run, I passed by, saw an ice cream shop and said, "Oh, an ice cream shop with little tables outside." So I had an ice cream there, sitting in the open air. Well, in the open air, it wasn't exactly cool. I mean, it was in the sun. That's how things are. What you can't say, not just about Berlin, which I imagine doesn't have a high of 23 degrees, I can picture that. But you can't say it about Ukraine either, about Zelensky, who are in a panic, about the Europeans who are also in panic and terror mode, and about others who right now are desperate, beyond desperate, in a full-blown nervous breakdown. And of course, the one also having a full-blown nervous breakdown is General Syrsky, the head of the Ukrainian armed forces, who at this moment sees his position in danger in every possible way.
Here, the map I'm going to present shows the last few days, so you can analyze the current situation. This is the map from the 6th of this month, November 6th, about a week ago. Everyone, of course, is paying attention to the encirclements in Pokrovsk and in Kupiansk. This is the situation in the southern part of the front, especially in the eastern region of the Zaporizhzhia Oblast. And from that day on, suddenly, the following happened. Pay attention to this development. First, this. On the 7th, reports of advances and confirmations of progress with the capture of this locality, all of them previously heavily bombed with Fab 1500 and even Fab 3000 bombs. And so the Russians, a bit faster, were already beginning their advances on the 7th.
Comenzaban con los avances. Aquí ya los ataques hacia
Here the attacks are already directed at specific positions, at these farms, houses, well, drone attacks, vehicle destruction, many vehicles destroyed. And finally, on the 7th, in several locations, the Russian flag flying for the first time. This is the current situation, about 5 days ago from the 6th to the 7th. Well, the advances recorded in all these areas marked here with flags, all of them documented in this progress video. But not only that, the next day, suddenly, more announcements of new advances, increasingly larger ones. This across all the mappers. And once again, video confirmation of the capture of a new locality. Here again the images. This on the 9th. Once again, artillery bombs, drones, and finally, the tricolour flag flying. Watch out for, oh indeed, there are the Russian soldiers capturing a new locality.
una nueva localidad. Presento todo esto muy rápido para que Fernando pueda realizar...
I'm presenting all this very quickly so that Fernando can carry out the current analysis. This was on the 9th. One day later, attention, all the advances confirmed, and in addition, several new ones added, also confirmed from there. Here, for example, this map, colored in red, a new town or locality confirmed, taken by Russia. We're showing it again at higher speed. Here the previous operations, and soon the Russian flag waving again. Drones even down in the basements, more or less. Many vehicles destroyed here as well. All Ukrainian defenses destroyed, drones intercepted. Well, and finally the Russian flag waving here too. This, on the day. There, even capturing a vehicle. Well, all this on the 11th, already with much larger and confirmed advances. Ah, here's another advance, and another one. The ball's rolling.
Yes, I'm telling you now. This just keeps going. They don't stop. I mean, I'm sure that by the time we finish the show, it'll already be outdated, because they'll have made more progress.
Yes, and besides, everything is documented on video, Fernando. This isn't. Yes, they're moving at cruising speed. Yes. Here again, images of all kinds of attacks. Well there, a poor soldier dead, or at least hit, whether dead or not. Here one of those turtle tanks destroyed, a pickup truck.
Yeah, they're coming in from everywhere already.
That is to say, it's like, wow, that one with the drone hit right in the chest. Yes. And surely toward the end, the Russian flag waving as well. Now it's confirmed this advance in the town of Solodot, and there are also reports of attacks toward Rimbapilia. This was yesterday, and Yabanklov. That's why the tank is drawn there. And finally, today it's confirmed again here, another one, and the advance toward Yabanklov also confirmed. The entire area surrounding this town has also been taken. Another video.
Otro video más. Drones por doquier, artillería.
Drones everywhere, conventional artillery, bombs, and finally the ground advances of Russian soldiers here. 4 or 5 videos of, interesting, from drone in the background, of documented captures with the Russian flag. Fernando, Huliaipole, completely undefended in the face of this situation. Here, by the way, Fernando, the deep state map, the go-to mapper for Ukraine, acknowledging this situation. So the Ukrainians themselves are recognizing it. What is the real situation here, in this whole region, and above all in Huliaipole, Fernando?
Terrible. And now we're going to break it down a bit. But look, while everyone was focused on Procross, whether Procross would fall, whether it had already taken this street or that one, whether the siege was closing in, we kept talking Wednesday, Sunday, saying, well, yes, the process is going well and all that, but there are also things happening elsewhere. And one of the things we kept saying, which people have practically forgotten, is watch out, the real turning point. Look at this. The key moment here, the inflection point, was about a year and a month ago, the capture of Uman. Do you remember? The capture of Ugreda, which has practically disappeared from the map. You have to go over there to look for it, and you can't find it. That is the capture of Ugreda, which had been attacked 3 times by the Russians in frontal assaults that were a disaster and which they finally took. So at the time we pointed out, this is key. This is a turning point. And indeed it was a turning point, because from that moment on, in that entire sector of the front, progress has been faster than anywhere else, and more territory has been taken than anywhere else. But as I was saying, while the useless people in the Western media are doing their own thing, this, that, and the other, we end up saying, watch out, disaster is on the way, and the disaster has already arrived. Now let's explain a bit what's going on, right? Something we've also been saying for at least a year and a half. The Ukrainians don't have enough troops. That's why they're carrying out these wild mobilizations, kidnapping people off the streets, wherever they can. That's why they've even brought in women. There are women's units. That's why they're already desperate, wondering if after lowering the draft age from 25 to 23, or was it from 27 to 25, I can't remember. It was from 27 to 25, right? I think so. Yeah, well, now they're thinking about lowering it to 18 for good because they don't have enough people. And as we've explained many times, there's just no more to give. I mean, you take the size of their population, about 20 million, look at their population pyramid, and that's it. There's no more to work with. This can't go much further. Since they don't have enough troops, the problem is that Syrskyi, and this is something Ukrainian sources criticize him for, say, well, while you were fighting, because Syrskyi was the one in charge of the defense of Bakhmut, Artemivsk, remember? That was already, what, in 2023, if I'm not mistaken. More or less. Yeah, 2023 already. Well, of course, when there was only one main front, Wagner and the others were there, and you had to fight them. You could do it better or worse, but you didn't have to spread yourself across multiple fronts. That ended a while ago. And now Syrskyi has the problem of having 4, 5, 6 open bleeding areas, and it's not so easy anymore. It's no longer about focusing on one, you have to focus on 6. And then you have to figure out how to distribute insufficient troops. What happened? Faced with the advance, well, that's where the microfront strategy came in. They went to Sumy first, stopped the Russians in Sumy. But of course the Russians said, fine, you stop us here, but while you're concentrating troops in Sumy, I'll relocate mine, move them, and take them to Pokrovsk. Sumy doesn't matter that much to me.
That is the result. Sumy in the north, after the attack on Kupiansk. Sorry, on...
Remember, when the Russians completely retake Kursk, and up north in Sumy, start entering Ukrainian territory, well, that's where they're stopped. They make sure things don't escalate because the city of Sumy was very close by. The Russians don't have major problems. I mean, they keep fighting there and all. But most of them, taking advantage of the fact that the Ukrainians have had to concentrate troops in that area, move to other points on the front from which those troops have been withdrawn. And one of those places is Pokrovsk, also Kupiansk, but especially Pokrovsk. What happens then? The Russians take advantage and advance. And the encirclement we've been seeing over the past few months begins until it tightens. Desperately, in the last month and a half or so, October, September, and so on, it's already becoming clear that things are going very badly. And in desperation, Syrskyi, the head of the Ukrainians, the commander-in-chief, starts sending units however he can. He says, because if Pokrovsk falls, the mess that'll come down on me is enormous. It's the worst thing that could happen to me at first. Because if I lose Kupiansk, well, I lose part of Kharkiv, I pull back behind the Seversky Donets River, and so on. And well, it's not that serious either. I lose Siversk. Well, they're getting closer to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, but okay, it's not that serious, and that's how you can start seeing other things. But then Kostiantynivka, well, it's more of the same. They're getting closer, in this case from the south, to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. But if I lose Pokrovsk, then we're in trouble, because it used to be a logistical hub, right? It hasn't been for a while, but it was a key logistical hub for the Ukrainian army. If the Russians take it, well, they already have, that means it's going to become a key logistical hub for the Russians in their advance toward the Dnipro, in their advance westward. So then what does Syrskyi do? He says, wow, we've really got a mess here. And he starts moving troops, and more troops. The problem is, since he doesn't have enough personnel, it's a huge mix of different units. In fact, if you take a look, well, we'll do that now, at the units and so on, we'll see a bunch of them. But really, for example, when you see on some map, regiment or battalion, both Kamieni and Rosipny, I know they're separated. What does separated mean here? That they don't get along with each other? No. That is, separated means that it was part of a regiment, Regiment X. And for reasons of military necessity, offensives or whatever, they took a battalion from that regiment and moved it somewhere else, outside the regiment. That's why it's called separated. Well, the mess they've got going on there is tremendous. Why? Because Syrskyi has first focused on dismantling that attack to the north that the Russians launched at the beginning of August, and he's deployed a lot of entire forces there in turn to prevent disaster. Of course, this has indeed managed to stop it, but at a tremendous cost, leaving other parts of the front unprotected. Just like now with Pokrovsk, trying to prevent that from becoming a disaster, and at the same time making sure the media everywhere report on the Pokrovsk disaster, they've moved everything they could there. That means other areas of the front have been left even more exposed. And which area of the front has been left particularly unprotected? The one we're going to talk about now, the area near Huliaipole, so to speak. This has allowed the Russians, while the attention of Western media, the major outlets, was focused on Pokrovsk. And we kept saying, careful, yes, they're going to take Pokrovsk and all that, but the advance through Zaporizhzhia, that's a disaster. Well, the disaster has indeed happened, and now Syrskyi has a huge problem on his hands. Anyway, I've lost Pokrovsk, but I have to stay here doing whatever it takes, because it's not just about losing Pokrovsk. They're going to keep advancing. And beyond Pokrovsk, we have the same problem as in Zaporizhzhia. They entered Dnipro, and there's nothing, no front lines, just scattered units with poor communications. And of course, what happens? While everyone was looking over there, we, who were watching here, were already warning we're facing the last line of defense of Pokrovsk. And now we're going to the river, where Panivka is, which was the center of the area, the vital center of the area. And there we had, on the river, I'm always terrible at this, on the river, Yanchul.
Yanchul.
Well, this sounds like Chinese, but what can you do? So, in this river, let's see, you can see there's a series, well, I don't know if you can actually see it, a series of localities, small villages, towns, and so on, whose vital center, the one that, let's say, structured that whole defensive line taking advantage of the river with fortifications and all that, was Uspanivka, the largest town or the largest city, whatever you want to call it. Because generally, what you find around here are just villages and hamlets. Let's not think we're already, no, actual cities, very few. That is, small, very small ones, if they can even be called cities. Anyway, along this line, while the others, Syrskyi and company, were busy sending units into Pokrovsk like there was no tomorrow, the Russians have been advancing here. They've been advancing, and this entire line we see here, which Ezekiel is pointing out perfectly, they've been taking it bit by bit. They started in the south with, what's it called, Poltavka or something like that. Poltavka, right? They started here with that one, and from there one, then another, and so on until only one was left. Uspanivka, or Uspanovka, I can never remember which one's the big one. You know, the key one. Well, they took that one about, 6 days ago? Something like that, very recently. So they finished taking it, now they have this whole fortified area, and between this fortified area and Huliaipole, what's there? Basically nothing. And that's where the trouble starts. That is trouble for the Ukrainians. Why? Because once they take Uspanivka, they immediately start advancing on Novas and a series of other towns we can see here. And the problem is that what they find there are only small units of soldiers, and on top of that, low-quality units within the Ukrainian army. We're not talking about elite units, but quite the opposite. As we'll see in a moment, National Guard units, territorial units, not even that. Territorial units would be, well, if we simplify a lot, we have the army, the Ukrainian army, then the Ukrainian National Guard, which is lower in quality. We're simplifying a lot. There are nuances, of course. But anyway, below that are the territorial troops, which were originally stationed in each province and were not prepared to move outside their own province. They were, well, as the name suggests, territorial troops, which means they're the lowest quality ones. And what's there? Basically that. And few of them on top of that, because there aren't any more. That is what we've been saying. There aren't more troops, there's what there is, and fewer each time. Because let's not forget, as we showed, I think the day before, the number of these, I was going to say immigrants. No, the number of, oh, I can't think of the word. The number of deserters is staggering. 300,000, something tremendous.
300,000, una cosa tremenda. El número también
The number of casualties is also increasing, which means the replacement rate, that is, if you need 40,000 more men per month to maintain the same strength, taking into account losses in different sectors, has long since become impossible to meet. That's why they have fewer and fewer people on the front line, and on average, fewer soldiers per square kilometer to defend. This is what has happened to them on the Huliaipole front. They don't have soldiers per square meter, and the front line no longer exists as it does elsewhere. And I don't know if you have those maps I sent you, where you can clearly see the disaster they're facing. And now we'll move on to some statements made by Ukrainian sources, not the Russians, Ukrainian sources. So, what's the situation?
Here, Fernando, one of your maps. Is this the one you wanted, or the other one?
Doesn't matter. Yes, more or less. The order doesn't change the sum in this case. For example, this one. Here we can see it. There we see Huliaipole below in a little white square. I'm not sure if you can see it. There in a little white square, Huliaipole. Good, and here we're going to see the two main units that are defending this sector. The advance we've been seeing is to the north, that part in red and yellow. There you see it above, thicker. This is the main Russian advance. That is, as you can see, the main advance is north of Huliaipole, where they're going to catch it from the rear, right where the fortifications are going to be. Well, we'll see that now. Who's defending this? Well, I'll tell you, besides, I've got it written down here on a cheat sheet, to be honest, because otherwise I'd lose track. Well, first of all, who's attacking here? Look, the battalion, well, the Vostok Regiment, which belongs to the National Guard. That is, let's explain who the Russians of the National Guard are. The Russians also have layers. They have the army itself, and what they now call the National Guard, which used to be the Interior Ministry troops. In practice, they're almost like the army. Actually, not even almost. Besides, this is a very battle-hardened unit. The Vostok unit has been fighting, if I'm not mistaken, since 2014 or since it was created. It's a unit initially made up of members from the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, as well as Russian volunteers, etc. Well, this unit, the one causing that disaster for the Ukrainians here in this advance, as I said, is facing, and this is important, these two units I have here, the 102nd Territorial Defense Brigade, which is one of them. The 102nd Territorial Defense Brigade is not part of this whole large corps. You know how this goes. An army corps usually has 3 or more divisions, then come the divisions, which can have around 9,000 to 10,000 or 11,000 men, depending on each army and so on. Regiments, all that, if they're at full strength, which is rarely the case, a regiment can have 3,000, 3,500, around there. Then the battalion, 600, 700, just to give us an idea, right? Well, so there we have, as I said, in the Liva area to the north, the 102nd Territorial Defense Brigade, one of those lower quality ones, which isn't part of the 20th Army Corps, the one that controls this whole wide region, but is instead assigned to it. with all the problems that brings. In other words, it's not part of an integrated army corps. They pulled it from somewhere else and just stuck it there, haphazardly. So right away, problems of all kinds. And mind you, look at what they say. These are Ukrainian sources. Everything I'm telling you. They say that the units fighting in this sector, right in the area where the Russian army manages to break through what we were talking about, are the two worst brigades, according to Ukrainian sources. Maybe not on their own, but because of the way they're integrated into the 20th Army Corps, they're the worst. That's what the Ukrainians say, not the Russians. And the other one there, the one we see below, the one with the long tongue and the blue one, is the 110th. The 110th, which they call mutant. And what's that about mutant? It's not that it's made up of mutants, right? The Martians haven't arrived yet, the X-Patrol, the X-Men, right? No, not for now. We'll see in the future. We'll leave that to Elon Musk and Peter Thiel to handle creating mutants and all that. Anyway, it's called mutant because it's a mix, I mean. Also, the regular battalions have been assigned at least 4 external battalions. Just look at how this brigade is doing, with 4 external battalions, because it doesn't have enough personnel. 2 of those 4 battalions are also from territorial defense brigades, and the 3rd from the National Guard, which aren't elite forces, according to the Ukrainians. As a result, the front is so stretched that they don't have, because it's the Ukrainians speaking, enough forces for all the enemy offensives. In the Huliaipole area, I'm reading that the armed forces of Ukraine are facing a catastrophe. This is according to Ukrainian sources. And it's confirmed by a Ukrainian war correspondent, Bogdan Moroznikov, who is on the front line. He's anti-Russian, meaning it's not just anyone saying this. Well, this man says the following, in quotes. The spokespeople say one thing, the commander-in-chief Serky acknowledges only 3 localities lost. In reality, there are more, he says. He reports later, notice this, he already takes it for granted that Huliaipole is going to fall. And look what he says. After Huliaipole will come Orehov, and then, besides Kamienskaya and Stepanogorsk, which are right on the Dnipro, the Russians are also fighting there. There won't be much left to stop the Russian armed forces from approaching the southern outskirts of Zaporizhzhia. This will also affect the settlement of Prokroskoye. Not Prokros, but Prokroskoye, which is a bit further up. We'll talk about it now. And if the enemy captures it, they could reach Volnyansk, and that would then be tactical operational successes for the enemy and a real catastrophe, according to Moroznikov. According to General Tabanansky, who leads the defense of this region, he sends false reports to his superiors. In short, the height of disaster. Let's see.
On the map, this gentleman's statements, please. What's the forecast for the progress, once again? From where to where?
That Huliaipole is going to fall. Here we go. There we have Huliaipole. That the next one, another major stronghold, Orehov, is going to fall. Here. Then, there, where they're already fighting on the Dnieper and Kamienskaya, just a bit further on, all of that is going to fall, and they'll set up in Zaporizhzhia just like that. And then, moreover, if Prokroskoye falls, which is right in Dnipropetrovsk, a bit further north, where the Russians are also very close, if Prokroskoye falls, then the field will be open to advance all the way to the Dnieper, but through Dnipropetrovsk. In other words, a disaster. A disaster. This is what a Ukrainian war correspondent at the front is saying. He must know something. I mean, well, they already consider Huliaipole lost. Why? Because these 2 units we're looking at, the ones we talked about earlier, what are they doing? Since they don't have enough men and they're not experienced, they're not even fighting anymore in those wooded areas that border the farmland. They're retreating toward Huliaipole. They don't have the capacity to hold the villages that remain before Huliaipole. The last thing I was able to see right before we started is that it's practically a done deal already. Russian advance units are practically on the outskirts of Huliaipole.
Las avanzadillas rusas están ya prácticamente a las afueras de Huliaipole. Estamos hablando de exploradores y tal, que esto todavía...
We're talking about scouts and all that, and this still, well, it's not going to take long, because at the speed they're going, look at what they were saying, that the Ukrainians themselves are terrified, because over a front about 20 or 25 kilometers wide, they've advanced in a couple of days about 10 kilometers deep. What is this? A positional war. It's absurd. I mean, when they often tell you, no, we've advanced 200 meters. And everyone's so happy because one side or the other has advanced 200 meters. Incredible. Incredible. And look at what they're saying that, well, things can't go much further. That is, they're also having problems because now there's no, since everything's already chaotic, they're having trouble with everything. Logistical problems. They no longer have good logistics, to put it mildly. I mean, their logistics are terrible. What is fundamentally holding the Russians back or greatly slowing their advance? And what is sustaining the Ukrainian army? Drones. The drone war, which makes that advance very difficult. Well, in this case, the Russian superiority in drones over the Ukrainians is overwhelming. The Ukrainians themselves complain that they don't have drone operators or the necessary drones, that they're elsewhere and there are no more. In other words, they just don't have them. This is what's allowing such rapid progress. There are no drones, a disaster. Because as I said, we're actually seeing the collapse of a sector of the front. Notice that even the Ukrainians themselves, the war correspondent, statistically says, consider that area lost. Well, maybe it'll hold, maybe it'll last a month, no one knows, probably less, because there are no troops. And in the end, we'll have just to imagine that Syrsky, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, says, no, this is a disaster, and so on. And Zelensky, terrified, says, send in units. Then what the Russians will do is advance in another sector, because there's nothing left to give.
I don't know if you have the map around. The other one. The one with the... I was following your words, Fernando, with the online map from that Ukrainian war correspondent. Because there, or just now, we were showing a screenshot of that map. Here, with his live map, with the daily updates. The map is really good, and it's documenting the tremendous advances of the last few days. According to this map, all the little Russian flags, shown in the previous videos, are documented here. According to this mapper, the Russians are already entering there, yes, even more advanced than in our more conservative map. So according to the Ukrainians themselves, the situation is worse than what a more neutral mapper described. Some of the more serious mappers already consider those areas taken by the Russians. Then, if these two are taken, look at the distance from those two to Huliaipole, if it's here.
That is, how much could be left? The Russian vanguards that have advanced the farthest are already almost on the outskirts.
Yes, also everything's farmland, Fernando.
All countryside, there's nothing there. Yes, absolutely nothing. And moreover, it's not just that there's nothing. There aren't even villages, right? Once you take... These are villages, okay? Villages that maybe had 200 people before the war. Just to give you an idea, look, that's a street with 4 little houses. So they're falling one after another because there's practically no resistance left. Look, here are another 3 streets with 4 houses on each side. In other words, they're falling one after another. Why are they retreating? Because they can no longer withstand or hold back the Russian advance. Let's not forget, they're also dropping all kinds of fabs here. That is, glide bombs. They're pounding them with artillery, and of course also hitting them with drones, and they've got nothing. That is to say, well, as I was saying, they're retreating to Huliaipole. And if we look at Huliaipole, and the other map I sent you, the one with the fortifications, it's interesting to see what the Russians are doing. I mean, why are they entering through there? Since the beginning of the war, as we can see here, they've been trying to break in from the south. And that's difficult because there are a lot of fortifications. Look, in yellow, the fortifications. Here we have in red, Huliaipole. Down here, all the way to the south, there's Huliaipole. And we can see the fortifications all over the south. Massive ones. Because what the Ukrainians were expecting was an offensive from the south, which at first seemed the most logical, right? Here we have this place, Ribonophilia. That's the one they're already taking, if they haven't taken it yet. In green, these have already been taken, Upanivka, Nove, Slobode, or something like that. All of this is already taken. This is already outdated. That is, notice that the advance is toward the north, and here we can clearly see another Dobrophilia. There's another one in Progros. There are so many towns with the same name. It's remarkable. Around this road, there are some small towns that would form the last defensive line of Zaporizhzhia, but its center, its axis, is Huliaipole. If you look, Huliaipole is here. There are some small fortifications behind it, but they have nothing to do with what's in the south. That is to say, they're going to come in from the north and through Selene. This road connects, it's one of the logistical areas. They're going to cut off this road and come in through where there are fewer fortifications. It's very clear, meaning from Selene there's nothing. You can come in from Barbaga, I don't know what, it's not clear. So there, and if you move south, what's there? 4 small fortifications, nothing more. And you come in, indeed, along the road, and they're done for. Besides, they're going to be attacked. Because in the end, you can build all the fortifications in the world, the best in human history. But if you don't have soldiers to defend them, it doesn't matter. And the problem is, they don't have soldiers to defend them. And besides, they have troops who aren't going to fight to the last man, unlike highly motivated elite forces. In other words, this is a disaster. And of course, as I said, from here on, look, that maneuver coming in from the north, at the same time they're advancing, as we can see, from the east, which is the key area, and they're also going to be under pressure from the south. Notice that the Russian side, shown here in red from the south, is relatively close, this place called Martopil, or something like that. Well, they're going to be under pressure from all sides, but the main attack will come from the rear, and from there, disaster. Because if you look, Orikhiv is farther south. If we look closely, Orikhiv is a bit farther south.
From here on, I can't show it, but I'll show it on the other map, Fernando.
Well, but just to show what a monstrous disaster this is. Look, there's Huliaipole, and Orihov is further south. That means they're coming at them again from the rear, where there are hardly any fortifications, and they'll crush them. And from there, once all this is taken, the 2 major strongholds they had held for almost, well, not quite, but for the last 2 years, against the Russian offensives, that's it. In other words, from that point on, it's an open road all the way to the city of Zaporizhzhia, and because there's nothing there. Anyway, once those 2 major strongholds with all their logistics are lost, it's over. That is, all this will happen in a situation of total disarray, because there are no troops here. I mean, there are troops in Orehov and troops in Huliaipole, but the ones defending in Huliaipole's case are these brigades, and in Orehov they don't have many either, because, let's not forget, they've had to pull them out of here, from Gerson and so on, to a bunch of other places. Because they no longer have enough troops. And this is the great disaster. This winter is going to be decisive in the war between NATO and Russia in Ukraine. Because in the end, Russia's superiority in manpower and drones keeps growing. And it shows. I mean, in the end, war is largely about numbers. more men, more troops, industrial production, attacks on the rear, what we were talking about the other day, the massive missile strike, the attacks on all kinds of energy facilities. In the end, this can't hold. It's going to collapse.
Fernando, what's the situation here in this region, even closer to Zaporizhzhia? Because according to what was read today, the Ukrainians would have decided to evacuate this town, Malakaterynivka, as a result of the advances both in Promychorn and here in these houses along the reservoir. Yes, the reservoir. They call this a Dnipro reservoir. Yes, exactly. Just look at the distance. They're abandoning this area, Fernando. If they abandon this area, they're basically validating the Russian advance without resistance up to this point. Look where Zaporizhzhia is. This town, Kujuyum, is now directly connected to Zaporizhzhia, which is just a bit further up. There you have it. Notice that they'll be coming in from the south, from the east, and from the north, because once they start advancing, those from the north will come in as well.
A very complicated situation. Really complicated. And we're not talking about this will happen, like the stories we get here from Western media movies, saying it will happen many years from now. Or like they're still saying, which is absurd. No, the front is stalled. Well, thank goodness it's stalled. I mean, and let's not forget that at the moment this is already happening, when the battle for Pokrovsk and Minograd hasn't yet ended. Pokrovsk is already conquered, but Minograd is falling. Then, if you want, we can talk a bit more, but there's less and less left. Both of the towns that were to the south are gone, and so on. Well, when that's all over, once it's cleared of any small units still resisting and so on, and it's prepared as a new logistical hub for the Russians, just think about the advantage they'll have along the roads, along the E50 itself, which has cost the Russians so much. Now they'll have a clear path to move along that road toward Dnipro. That's why we're seeing that right now. Both Zaporizhzhia and Dnipro are being bombed every day. In other words, they're pounding them, obviously preparing, softening up the ground, as they say in military terms, for when the time comes for the siege and the attack. But the other one, which is Pablo Horat, is in Dnipro, halfway between this. Look, here we have it. Dnipro is up here, and Pavlograd is over there in the middle, roughly halfway between Dnipro and Pavlograd. Once they take Pokrovsk, since there are no units or fortifications around here, etc., the advance along the roads controlled by the Russians will be much faster. There's already less and less drone attack capability here. In other words, a tremendous disaster. Just to give us an idea, we were talking at the beginning about Vuhledar, which was taken a year and a month ago. Well, the distance, and now that they're advancing much faster, the distance between Vuhledar and Vuhledar and the current frontline area is roughly the same as between Vuhledar and the capital of Zaporizhzhia, approximately. If you look at a map, you'll see around there, around there. That is to say, at the speed and in the situation they're in, well, Vuhledar apparently won't last very long, unless they start pulling troops from elsewhere in a desperate way to plug the huge gap on the flank. But then, if they pull troops from somewhere else, won't the Russians take advantage of that to make another major advance on that side? In other words, wherever they pull troops from. The thing is, there aren't any left, and where there aren't any, well, it's impossible. And we are therefore witnessing a new phase of the war that will have little to do with what we've seen so far, and where the collapse of this sector of the front will affect the entire front. It's possible that this winter, we may even see the final collapse of the Ukrainian army. That's why the people at Sadek and company are desperate. That's why the Europeans are desperate, the Democrats in the United States, the non-Trumpist Republicans, because all the warmongers are now terrified, since their whole Ukraine setup is coming to an end. A winter that will be an energy disaster. especially in the eastern region.
Un invierno que va a ser un desastre energético, especialmente en la zona oriental.
Sí. Para colmo, Fernando, recién destapada una olla.
To top it off, Fernando, a huge corruption case has just been uncovered involving the Secretary of Justice, the former Minister of Justice, and the former Minister of Energy, people very close to Zelensky, many from his inner circle. A tremendous corruption scandal involving the use of energy purchases for laundering corruption money. Money coming from the West, of course, right? So pressure from all sides. Dear Fernando, today we're going to wrap up with your... Yes, just one thing, very briefly, because I already promised Mr. Pablo Borges from the Palabras Mayores channel to join a live broadcast on his channel in about 5 minutes. That's why we'll wrap up your closing remarks first.
Solo
una pequeña punta de lo que...
Just a small note on what you were saying. Let's not forget that the agencies bringing up these corruption cases were created by the United States and are controlled by the United States. In other words, this could be seen as an operation, and they did nothing for many years. An operation to get rid of the middle skeleton. We'll talk more about it next time.
Ya hablaremos el próximo día.
Sí, porque qué curioso, ¿no?
Qué casualidad.
Yes, because how curious, right? How curious that the pot gets uncovered just now. What a coincidence. Yes. Demolishers, to those who haven't yet given us a thumbs up, a like, please remember to do so. That helps us fight censorship. Well, I'm heading right now to Pablo Borges' channel, Palabras Mayores, and in about an hour, as always, today's Wednesday show with Eduardo Vior tonight. And well, tomorrow we'll be back with our usual programming. Fernando, again on Friday at 11 p.m. right here. And we'll be together, Fernando, on Sunday.
Y nosotros juntos, Fernando, el domingo.
El domingo de nuevo.
Sunday again. Don't miss a thing, because this is moving so fast that by Friday I can't even tell you they'll already be in Huliaipole. And by Sunday, half of Huliaipole will have fallen. So, stay fully tuned to the Demoliendo Mitos channel, with Ezequiel Bistoletti and yours truly here alongside.
Dear Fernando, 1,000 thanks as always. Beatriz Pulido, our moderator, thanks to you as well. Thank you. To the demolishers, both men and women, a hug. Bye-bye.
See you later.
¿Qué?